Welcome to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's virtual public presentation for the Shaffer Equipment Arbuckle Creek Area Superfund Site Remedial Investigation Update. My name is Patrick McGettigan, and I am an EPA Community Involvement Coordinator for the site. You will also be hearing from my colleague, Lisa Trackus, who is also a Community Involvement Coordinator for the site, and Aaron Raz, the site's Remedial Project Manager, during this presentation. EPA is committed to protecting public health, and with the current COVID-19 health emergency restrictions and recommendations, this video is being published in place of an in-person public meeting. The presentation in this video has the same information that EPA would have shared during an in-person public meeting.
Hello, I'm Lisa Trackus, an EPA Community Involvement Coordinator. The goal of this presentation is to provide information on the sampling results from the first remedial investigation that was performed from November 2019 through March 2020 and discuss next steps at the site. Aaron will discuss the sampling results from each portion of the site sampled. Please see the Shaffer Superfund Site webpage for publicly available information and additional information or updates on the site at any time.
Thank you, Patrick and Lisa. Hello, everyone. My name is Aaron Raz, and I'm the EPA Remedial Project Manager on the Shaffer Equipment Arbuckle Creek Area Superfund Site. As the newest members of the Shaffer Site team, we wanted to introduce ourselves and thank you for your continued support as we move through the Superfund process.
The current COVID-19 health emergency has impacted the way we engage with you, the community. It has also been one of the factors that delayed the return of sampling data and our plans for an in-person site visit. In order for you to have an opportunity to ask questions, as a follow-up to this presentation, the site team will hold a conference call on Thursday, January 7th from 6 to 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. To join this call, please call our toll-free number 866-299-3188 and enter the conference code 202-564-4714. We welcome your questions and feedback in advance of the conference call and encourage you to contact us at r3_Shaffer, SHAFFER, @epa.gov. Ask to join our mailing list to receive regular email updates from us.
Before we discuss the sampling results, a quick reminder on the Superfund process and where along this process the Shaffer Equipment Arbuckle Creek Area Superfund Site currently sits. Prior to being placed on the National Priority List in 2019, EPA conducted 3 removal actions. An additional removal action took place after the site was placed on the NPL from October 2019 through February 2020. These past actions were to remove hazardous materials of immediate concern. This is a complex, multi-phase process. We are currently in the early stages of the characterization phase, with investigation into the nature and extent of contamination at the site underway. The remedial investigation allows EPA to gather and analyze samples throughout the site and in nearby areas in order to assess potential threats posed by the site. Once the remedial investigation is complete, the evaluation of potential cleanup alternatives can begin in what is called a feasibility study. During the feasibility study, EPA explores the advantages and disadvantages of potential cleanup methods. Today, we will be discussing the sampling results from the first phase of the remedial investigation. We will also provide preliminary information on what to expect during phase 2 of the remedial investigation.
The Shaffer Equipment Arbuckle Creek Superfund Site encompasses the Shaffer Equipment Company property, Arbuckle Creek, contaminated sediments, and other areas where contamination may be located. This area may be expanded as we continue to gather data throughout the investigation. Site soils and sediments were historically contaminated with PCBs, which were used by the Shaffer Equipment Company from 1970 to 1984 to manufacture electrical substations for the local coal mining industry. Let me clarify that there are not two separate remedial investigations being performed. Data was collected during Phase 1 to help guide how the investigation will proceed in Phase 2. Both phases will be incorporated into the Remedial Investigation Report. Before I describe the results, I would like to provide an explanation of the phrase screening level, because you will hear this phrase throughout this presentation. During the remedial investigation, different sets of screening levels were used to compare the sampling results in order to guide the investigation with the goal to determine the nature and extent of contamination and potential impacts to human health. Results that exceed a screening level do not necessarily mean a problem exists. However, they do indicate that EPA should carefully evaluate the data and sometimes collect additional information to fully evaluate this potential concern. Actual cleanup levels will be established at the end of the investigation after all of the data and information is evaluated. 10 areas of interest were identified and investigated during the first phase of the remedial investigation. These areas are the Shaffer equipment property, the possible transformer storage area, the Brit bathhouse, the Berwyn Green Hill mine dump area, the Rocklick Road area, the NR&P supply house, the residential properties, the Arbuckle Creek and wetland, and the New River. Samples were also collected from northeast of the Shaffer Equipment Company property to help determine background concentrations. Not every sample was analyzed for the exact same parameters. All samples submitted to laboratories were analyzed for volatile organic compounds, semi-volatile organic compounds, pesticides, PCB congeners, dioxins, furans, and metals. 20% of all samples were analyzed for PCB air chlors. Additionally, approximately 25% of the soil collected near the surface and 25% of the sediment samples were analyzed for total organic carbon and grain size. An EPA mobile laboratory was used to analyze certain samples for PCB air chlors to help aid in the selection of deeper sample locations. As I mentioned during the list of analytical analyses, there were two types of PCB sampling that were performed: congeners and air chlors. PCBs are a group of man-made chemicals consisting of carbon, hydrogen, and chlorine atoms. The number and location of the chlorine atoms on each PCB molecule determine many of its physical and chemical properties. There are 209 different variations of chlorine numbers and locations on an individual PCB molecule. These 209 PCB molecules are referred to as congeners. PCB air chlor is a popular trade name of PCB mixtures that were used in the United States. The different air chlors generally indicate the percent of chlorine in the PCB mixture. The Shaffer Equipment Company property is approximately 5 acres in size and is adjacent to the Arbuckle Creek. From approximately 1970 to 1984, the Shaffer Equipment Company built electrical substations for the coal mining industry. Mismanagement of electrical transformers resulted in the release of PCBs to the environment. At the Shaffer Equipment property, 21 soil borings were installed, and from them, a total of 85 soil samples were collected. Multiple samples were collected from each soil boring to ensure that samples were collected at various depths. Soil samples at all soil boring locations contained PCBs or PCB-related constituent concentrations above screening levels, so additional investigation is required in this area. The next phase of sampling will likely include additional soil borings and the installation of monitoring wells on the Shaffer Equipment Company property. The monitoring wells will help determine if PCBs migrated into the groundwater. As presented in the October 2020 fact sheet, the highest total PCB congener concentration was 27 milligrams per kilogram, which is at a level that can be used to trigger an immediate response. This sample was collected 6 inches below the surface of the ground, where exposure is limited and only in a limited area. As a result, it was determined that an immediate response was not appropriate at this time. Additional investigation during the next phase will focus in this area of the elevated result. The possible transformer storage area is located directly east of the Shaffer Equipment Company property. This area was investigated because of where PCB containing transformers may have been stored, and reports that the Shaffer Equipment Company had dumped PCB contaminated oil in an area called the pit. At the possible transformer storage area, 14 soil borings were installed, and from them a total of 87 soil samples were collected. Multiple samples were collected from each soil boring to ensure that samples were collected at various depths. The highest PCB concentration detected in this area during Phase 1 was from 6 to 10 feet below the ground surface at a concentration of 6.69 milligrams per kilogram for Aerochlor 1260. Based on the results, additional investigation is needed in the possible former transformer area, likely in the area where PCB contaminated oil was reportedly dumped. During Phase 1, at the possible transformer area, there were no samples of PCBs that were above levels that could be used to trigger an immediate response, but there were historic results above these levels. The next phase of work will include additional sampling near the elevated historic results. The area referred to as the Brit bathhouse is located north of the former Shaffer Equipment property, on the other side of Arbuckle Creek. The area was used by the Shaffer Equipment Company for storage of miscellaneous equipment, and an abandoned transformer was observed during a site inspection in 1990. At the Brit bathhouse, 8 soil borings were installed, and from them a total of 32 soil samples were collected. Multiple samples were collected from each soil boring to ensure that samples were collected at various depths. From 2 locations on the western side of the Brit bathhouse area, surface water and sediment samples were collected. Concentrations were less than levels used to identify a human health risk that may trigger an immediate removal action. However, the majority of soil sample results above screening levels were located closer to Arbuckle Creek, and additional investigations will focus in this area. The Berwyn Green Hill Mine Dump area is located northeast of the former Shaffer Equipment property and is an area where sediments from Arbuckle Creek may have been disposed as part of flood control efforts. At the Berwyn Green Hill Mine Dump area, 8 soil borings were installed, and from them a total of 34 soil samples were collected. Multiple samples were collected from each soil boring to ensure that samples were collected at various depths. While there were some concentrations that exceeded screening values, we believe that there is enough data from this area to complete the remedial investigation, and therefore no additional samples need to be collected at this time. The Rocklick Road area is where PCB containing oil may have been sprayed for dust control, and there is also a portion of the road where sediments from Arbuckle Creek may have been placed. At the Rocklick Road area, 10 soil borings were installed, and from them a total of 30 soil samples were collected. Multiple samples were collected from each soil boring to ensure that samples were collected at various depths. At 7 locations along Rocklick Creek and 1 location from a marsh area between Rocklick Road and Rocklick Creek, surface water and sediment samples were also collected. While there were some concentrations that exceeded screening values, we believe that there is enough data from this area to complete the remedial investigation, and therefore no additional samples are likely to be collected from this area at this time. The NR&P Supply House area is located south of Arbuckle Creek and to the east of the former Shaffer Equipment Company property. The NR&P Supply House area is an abandoned substation that at one point contained 6 abandoned transformers in the basement of the building. At the NR&P Supply House area, 3 soil borings were installed, and from them 16 soil samples were collected. Multiple samples were collected from each soil boring to ensure that samples were collected at various depths. Additionally, surface water and sediment were collected from a culvert pipe that runs underneath the road, leaving the NR&P Supply House area. Concentrations were less than the levels used to identify a human health risk that may trigger an immediate removal action. However, some of the results were above screening levels from this area. Therefore, a limited number of additional samples will likely be collected in order to complete the remedial investigation. Soil samples were collected from several residential properties along Arbuckle Creek downstream of the former Shaffer Equipment property. Results were above screening levels, and EPA has requested additional sampling at all properties. Whether EPA performs the additional sampling is up to each resident, and we hope all residents will allow access for additional sampling. If the resident does not grant permission for additional sampling, EPA may collect data from nearby locations in order to complete the remedial investigation. The Arbuckle Creek area includes Arbuckle Creek starting at the Shaffer Equipment property and ending where the creek flows into the New River. Samples from 29 locations along Arbuckle Creek were collected. A surface water and sediment sample were collected at each of the locations. Additional surface water and sediment samples were collected in Arbuckle Creek at 3 locations upstream of the Shaffer Equipment property. Concentrations were less than the levels used to identify a human health risk that may trigger an immediate removal action. However, there were some results above screening levels, and additional samples will be needed to complete the remedial investigation. The Arbuckle Creek wetland areas are located adjacent to Arbuckle Creek in the vicinity of the residential properties. Surface water and sediment samples were collected from 12 locations. Like the sampling procedure for Arbuckle Creek, a surface water and sediment sample were collected from each location, except at 2 of the wetland locations where there was not enough water to collect a surface water sample. Concentrations were less than the levels used to identify a human health risk that may trigger an immediate removal action. However, there were some results above screening levels, and additional sampling will be needed to complete the remedial investigation. Arbuckle Creek flows into the New River, and 6 sediment samples were collected from the New River. 4 of these sediment samples were collected downstream of where Arbuckle Creek enters the New River. The other 2 sediment samples were collected upstream of where Arbuckle Creek enters the New River. A review of the results indicate that the upstream and downstream sediment results are similar. Additional sampling in the New River may not be needed, but a final determination will be made as the next set of sample locations are determined for Arbuckle Creek. Throughout my explanation, I have talked about the next part of the remedial investigation. The Phase 2 sampling is planned to begin in the spring of 2021 and continue into the summer and possibly the fall of 2021. The planning for that next phase is ongoing with the goal of determining the appropriate sample locations in order to complete the remedial investigation report. The remedial investigation report will include the site-specific human health and ecological risk assessments that are conducted to determine the need for action and to ensure that a selected remedy will be protected. Additionally, throughout the Superfund process, EPA may return to any area for additional investigation if we believe it is warranted.
Thanks, Aaron, for that detailed explanation of the sampling data and an overview of what happens next. As a reminder, community feedback is an important and valued part of the EPA Superfund process. EPA will be holding a conference call as an opportunity to answer questions about this presentation on Thursday, January 7th from 6 to 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. To join this call, please call our toll-free number at 866-299-3188 and enter the conference code 202-564-4714. We encourage you to submit questions in advance by emailing us at r3_Shaffer@epa.gov.
This concludes the presentation on Phase 1 of the remedial investigation for the Shaffer Equipment Arbuckle Creek Superfund Site. We look forward to speaking with you in January on the conference call. Please stay in touch with us by joining our mailing list and by emailing us at r3_Shaffer@epa.gov. Take care and be well.